Hey everyone, are you ready to dig into a topic that's both familiar and full of surprises?
I am.
We're taking a deep dive into the history of nostalgia.
Sounds intriguing.
It is, and we've got a great guide to lead us through it the way we were. A History of Nostalgia by Agnes Arnold-Forster.
I'm excited to see where this takes us.
Me too. You know, when we think about nostalgia, we often picture those warm, fuzzy feelings, memories of good times, maybe a touch of longing for the past. But the book reveals that nostalgia has a much more complex, even a darker history than most of us realize.
It does. I mean, think about it. You often hear people talk about nostalgia as if it's something relatively recent, a product of modern society. But it actually goes back centuries, and the way it was understood back then was vastly different from how we might view it today.
So are we talking like Victorian era different, or even further back?
Even further back, to find the origins of the word nostalgia, we have to travel all the way back to the 1680s.
Okay, now we're talking serious history. Who were the big thinkers back then when it came to nostalgia?
Well, there was a Swiss physician named Johannes Hofer. Now, get this. Hofer was studying Swiss mercenary soldiers who were hired to fight far from home.
Oh wow, so they were fighting in foreign lands,
Mm-hmm.
probably facing all sorts of danger and hardship.
Yeah.
That's got to be tough, being so far from everything familiar.
Exactly. And Hofer noticed something peculiar about these soldiers. They weren't just experiencing ordinary homesickness, they were suffering from a whole range of severe physical symptoms.
Great, so it was more than just missing home. What kind of symptoms?
We're talking about things like fever, insomnia, heart palpitations, loss of appetite. He even documented cases where nostalgia was actually listed as the cause of death.
Seriously, that's wild. They died from missing home. What was the prevailing medical explanation for that back then?
While Hofer theorized that it was triggered by specific things that reminded these soldiers of home, sensory experiences that would just amplify their longing, there's even a story about a Swiss milking song.
A song. Really, what song?
It was called Curien, and apparently it was so evocative, so powerful in its ability to trigger these intense feelings of longing that it was actually banned.
Wow, a song so potent it had to be banned. That's incredible. But how could something like homesickness, even extreme homesickness, have such a devastating physical effect?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I mean, our understanding of the mind-body connection was pretty different back then. It's easy to look back now and say, well, obviously, extreme emotional distress can manifest physically. But in Hofer's time, the idea that your feelings could literally make you sick, even kill you, was pretty radical.
That's a really great point. It makes you think about all the ways our understanding of something like homesickness has evolved. So we've gone from nostalgia being seen as this potentially deadly disease to a more general feeling of homesickness, right?
Right. Over the 18th and 19th centuries, you start to see a gradual shift in how nostalgia was viewed. It's not so much seen as this mysterious, deadly ailment anymore. As medical knowledge advanced, doctors began to understand it as an extreme form of homesickness, something that was rooted in psychology rather than purely physical causes.
And this shift coincided with some massive societal changes, didn't it? I'm thinking about the Industrial Revolution, mass migration, people leaving their homes for all sorts of reasons.
Exactly. And the book does a great job of putting these historical changes into perspective by highlighting personal stories, like that of Doris and Arnold, a couple who emigrated from England to America in the early 20th century.
It's so easy to get caught up in those broad historical narratives that we forget that these were real people going through these experiences.
Yeah.
What happened to Doris and Arnold?
Well, for Arnold, it seems the transition to a new life was pretty seamless. He thrived in America. But for Doris, it was a completely different story. She was absolutely crippled by homesickness, really struggled to adapt to this new life, this new world.
It really highlights just how personal and challenging navigating a new world can be, even today, doesn't it?
It does, and how those feelings of longing, that sense of displacement can be so powerful.
It's amazing how an emotion can manifest itself in so many different ways. From something as simple as missing your favorite childhood meal to something as profound and potentially debilitating as Doris's experience. Were there other stories that stood out?
There's a particularly poignant story about a young Jewish refugee named Edward Prager, who was sent to America in 1938 to escape the escalating persecution in Europe. Tragically, he ended up taking his own life.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
It really was. According to the book, he was just utterly overwhelmed by homesickness and that profound sense of isolation that can come with being uprooted, losing your home, your community, your entire way of life.
His story is a stark reminder of the profound impact that longing for home can have on a person's well-being, especially when it's coupled with trauma and loss. It makes you think about how our understanding of homesickness has shifted yet again, from this potentially deadly disease to a more nuanced understanding of its psychological effects. Yet at the same time, it feels like somewhere along the way, the seriousness of homesickness, especially for children, was almost trivialized.
You're right. By the mid-20th century, there's a noticeable shift in how homesickness, especially among children, was being approached. Instead of trying to understand the root cause of these feelings, it was as if there was a push to just, get over it.
So it went from being a serious condition to something to be dismissed, like, just buck up, kid.
In a way, yes. Psychologists at the time were encouraging parents to basically train their kids to be more independent, more self-reliant, almost as if homesickness was a sign of weakness or a failure to adapt.
It's fascinating how we went from one extreme viewing nostalgia as potentially deadly to the other, seeing it as something to be suppressed, almost like a developmental hurdle to overcome.
Right, and it makes you wonder if nostalgia, this intense longing for the past, was being dismissed or even pathologized by mainstream psychology. Where did that energy go? What happened next?
I don't know, but I'm ready to find out.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you had this mainstream psychology pushing back against nostalgia, but at the same time, you had all these other thinkers who were drawn to the complexities of these feelings, this yearning for the past. This is where psychoanalysis enters the picture.
Oh, psychoanalysis, the realm of Freud and the subconscious. So we're going even deeper into the human psyche now. Who were some of the key figures exploring nostalgia through this new lens?
One name that really stands out, and the book spends a fair bit of time on him, is Nandor Fodor. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting, because Fodor had this fascination bordering on obsession with the paranormal.
Okay, hold on a minute. We were talking about nostalgia, this longing for the past. Now we're bringing in ghosts and the supernatural. How did those two things connect in Fodor's mind?
So Fodor was utterly convinced that what we perceive as paranormal activity, ghosts, poltergeists, those sorts of things, weren't actually supernatural at all. He believed they were rooted in psychological states, that these strange occurrences were actually manifestations of, say, repressed memories or subconscious desires or anxieties bubbling up to the surface.
So instead of seeing a haunted house, he saw a haunted mind.
Exactly. And it gets even weirder. He even investigated a case involving something called Gif, the talking mongoose.
The talking mongoose. Okay, you have to tell me more about this talking mongoose. I've got so many questions.
So picture this. It's the 1930s, and you have this family on the Isle of Man who claim to have this talking mongoose living in the walls of their farmhouse. They called him Gif.
They named him... Wait, hold on. So they're saying they've got this chatty mongoose roommate, and they're giving him a name. This is just too good.
Right. And it wasn't just noises. They claimed Geff would hold conversations with them, had a bit of a personality, even developed a bit of a local following.
Okay, so how does a talking mongoose, even a very chatty one, tie back into nostalgia?
Well, Fodor believed that Geff wasn't actually a real creature. He thought Geff was a product of this family's collective psyche, their shared anxieties, desires, whatever it may be, manifesting as this talking mongoose.
So it was all in their heads. Their minds essentially invented this talking mongoose. That's wild.
It is wild, right? And for Fodor, both the talking mongoose and those feelings of nostalgia, they pointed towards a similar underlying issue, a struggle to cope with the present.
So while he wasn't necessarily saying nostalgia would make you drop dead like Hoofer did, he still saw it as a bit of a red flag. Like, maybe this person is a little too fixated on the past.
Exactly. It wasn't that nostalgia itself was this terrible, dangerous thing, but for Fodor, it seemed to be a sign of something deeper going on, something potentially unresolved, or even, a way of avoiding reality. But it's important to remember that psychoanalysis was evolving too. You had all these different thinkers with their own interpretations. It's not like Fodor had the final word on nostalgia.
So even within psychoanalysis, there were these contrasting views on what nostalgia meant, whether it was healthy or not. Were there any other psychoanalysts who challenged Fodor's, let's say, less than optimistic view of nostalgia?
Yeah. Around the 1970s, a psychoanalyst named David Werman offered a very different perspective. Now, unlike Fodor, who seemed to see nostalgia as this sign that something was a bit off, Werman believed that nostalgia was a completely normal human emotion.
Okay, so this is a pretty significant shift, right? We've gone from nostalgia being this potentially deadly disease to this sign that you're maybe not coping with the present to now a completely normal part of the human experience.
Exactly. And Werman's work really challenged those earlier assumptions and helped pave the way for this more balanced, I guess you could say, view of nostalgia. It wasn't inherently good or bad, right? It was just this complex emotion that we all experience, that everyone experiences at some point, with the potential for both positive and negative
It's like
effects.
anything else in life, right? Too much of anything can be a bad thing, even something that's generally seen as positive. But was there research to support Werman's theory?
Yes. And this is another really interesting shift that starts happening in the 1970s. You start to see research emerging that really dug into both the positive and negative aspects of nostalgia.
So up until that point, it seemed like most of the focus had been on the potential downsides. What were some of the positive aspects of nostalgia that this new wave of research started to uncover?
Well, for starters, researchers found that nostalgia could be a real source of comfort, especially during times of stress, uncertainty, those moments when you just need a little pick-me-up. They found that it could evoke those positive memories, remind people of happy times, which, come on, we all need that from time to time, right? And it wasn't just about individual benefits. They also found that nostalgia could actually strengthen social bonds by, reminding people of those shared experiences, those common cultural touchstones.
It's like when you hear a song from your childhood, and it just takes you right back to that moment, that feeling. It's almost like you get to relive it again.
Exactly. It's powerful stuff. And on top of that, researchers started to uncover that nostalgia could even boost self-esteem.
Really? How so?
Well, it's like when you're feeling a bit down on yourself and you start thinking back to a time when you felt more confident, more sure of yourself, more successful, whatever it may be. Nostalgia can connect us back to those more positive self-images from the past, which, let's be honest, we all do from time to time.
It's like having a mental photo album filled with your greatest hits.
Yes. And you can just flip through it whenever you need a little boost, a little reminder of who you are, where you come from, what you've overcome. It's about finding meaning and continuity in the face of all the changes that life throws at us. And this is where things start to get really interesting, because as we're figuring out that nostalgia isn't inherently good or bad, it's this powerful emotion with the potential to be both. Well, someone else is figuring that out too. Advertisers.
Oh no, here comes the
I
advertising.
know, right? But it makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, if you're trying to sell something, what better way to do it than to tap into this potent, primal human emotion? And this is where things start to shift again, because now nostalgia is no longer just a personal experience. Now it's being packaged and sold back to us.
And we see this everywhere now. Those vintage-inspired ads, products that promise to take us back to a simpler time. What were some of those early examples of marketers tapping into this powerful emotion? It really is amazing how much nostalgia factors into advertising.
Yeah.
Did they always know how powerful it was, or was there a specific moment when it really took off?
Well, the book points to the 1970s as this real turning point when advertisers started to truly grasp the power of nostalgia as a marketing tool. One of the examples that they highlight is this classic Hovis bread advertisement from 1973.
Oh yeah, I think I've seen that one. It's the one with the little boy pushing his bike up that cobblestone hill, right?
Right.
What was it about that ad that resonated so much with people?
Yeah, that's the one. It's such a simple ad, but so effective. And I think part of what made it work so well was that it tapped into this really romanticized view of the past, this yearning for a simpler time, a more wholesome time. They weren't just selling bread, they were selling a feeling, a connection to this bygone era.
It's like those images and sounds have this almost subconscious effect on us. Like even if we know it's just an ad, we can't help but feel a certain way when we see that little boy struggling up that hill with his bread.
Exactly. And you're right, it's often those really subtle cues that are the most effective, like a familiar song or a particular visual style can really transport us back and evoke all sorts of emotions that we might not even be consciously aware of.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it, how these seemingly insignificant details from our past can hold so much sway over how we see the world, how we make decisions, even what we choose to buy.
It is. And the thing about nostalgia is that it's not just about evoking those personal memories. Advertisers also started tapping into this broader sense of historical nostalgia.
Right, like those campaigns that use imagery from, say, the 1950s or the Wild West, right?
Exactly. They're creating these idealized versions of the past, often with very little connection to what those times were actually like, and then linking their product to that feeling.
It's brilliant from a marketing standpoint, really. I mean, they're tapping into something so primal, so fundamental to the human experience. This desire to connect with the past, to hold on to those memories, to recapture something that maybe we feel like we've lost. It's no wonder it's still such an effective strategy, even today.
It's true, you see it everywhere. Think about all these streaming services bringing back old TV shows, or those musicians who are pushing back against the whole shuffle button culture, releasing albums that are designed to be listened to in a specific order, or even the resurgence of 90s fashion.
It's everywhere you look. And nostalgia doesn't just influence the things we buy or the entertainment we consume. It shapes how we see the world around us, doesn't it?
Totally. And one of the things the book explores is this really interesting trend of idealizing certain historical periods, even when the reality of those times was probably pretty different from the romanticized versions we tend to create. For example, there's been this huge resurgence of interest in the Middle Ages.
Like all those Renaissance fairs and those medieval-themed restaurants, they're everywhere. It always seemed like harmless fun to me. You're telling me there's something deeper going on there.
Maybe. I mean, on the surface, it's easy to dismiss it as just a bit of fun, right? But the book suggests that this fascination with the past, whether it's the Middle Ages or some other bygone era, often reflects a deeper desire to connect with something that feels bigger than ourselves, something that has a sense of history and tradition, something that maybe we feel like is missing from our modern lives. It's like we're searching for a sense of belonging and meaning, and sometimes we find it by looking back instead of forward.
It makes you think about groups like the Society for Creative Anachronism, the SCA, those groups that completely immerse themselves in recreating medieval life, even if it's just on the weekends.
Right. Or even something like those super elaborate Civil War reenactments that happen all over. It's not just a hobby for these people, it's a way of life, a way of connecting with history in this really tangible way.
I get that. I mean, we're talking about nostalgia here, this longing for the past, and here you have people who are actively trying to recreate the past, even if it's just a carefully curated and idealized version of it. It makes you wonder, what does it say about us, about our relationship with history, that we're so drawn to these idealized versions of the past? Is it just harmless fun, or is it something more?
That's a great question, and it's one that we all have to grapple with, right? I mean, it would be easy to say that this fascination with the past is just that, a fascination. But the thing about nostalgia is that it's not just a personal feeling that we each experience in isolation. It's also a powerful force that shapes our perceptions of the world around us, including our political beliefs and ideologies.
So you're saying that our warm, fuzzy feelings about the past could actually be influencing our political decisions in the present? That's a fascinating and kind of scary thought.
It is interesting, isn't it? And the book talks about how nostalgia has been used to explain a lot of recent political phenomena. Like, for example, think about the rhetoric surrounding Brexit, with all that talk about a return to this, idealized vision of British sovereignty and national identity, or the rise of those leaders who promise to, quote unquote, make insert country here great again. These campaigns often tap into this very deep well of nostalgia, this longing for a time when things seemed better, simpler, or more in line with a particular set of values. And often that idealized version of the past is based more on feeling than on, actual historical fact.
It's easy to get swept up in those kinds of narratives, isn't it? Especially when they're presented in this really emotionally charged way, appealing to our hearts rather than our heads. But does that mean that nostalgia is inherently political?
No, not necessarily. I mean, on its own, nostalgia isn't inherently political. It's an emotion, right? We all feel nostalgic from time to time, regardless of where we fall on the political spectrum. But here's the thing. Like any powerful emotion, nostalgia can be harnessed, it can be channeled, it can be used to support various agendas, whether it's selling us a product or promoting a particular political ideology.
So it's not about avoiding nostalgia altogether, it's about being aware of how it might be influencing our own thinking and being critical how it's being used by others.
Exactly. It's about asking yourself, am I longing for this idealized version of the past? Or am I longing for something else? Am I longing for something that maybe never even existed in the first place?
That's a great point. It's so easy to get swept up in those romanticized visions of the past that we lose sight of the present and what we can actually do to shape the future.
Right. And to wrap up this deep dive into the world of nostalgia, the book leaves us with this really interesting case study about the NHS, Britain's healthcare system.
I'm intrigued. What does the NHS have to do with nostalgia?
Well, it turns out that for many people in Britain, particularly those who remember a time before the NHS or who grew up hearing stories about it. The NHS evokes a very strong sense of nostalgia, this longing for a time when healthcare was, supposedly more personal, more efficient, more in line with a certain set of values.
It's like that saying, everyone's always talking about the good old days, even when they were living through them at the time. But it feels like more than just that with something like healthcare. We're talking about our well-being, our families, our survival. It's deeply personal.
Exactly. And because it's such a personal, even a primal issue for people, it makes it ripe for this kind of nostalgic lens. The book argues that this nostalgia surrounding the NHS has had a real and measurable impact on healthcare debates in Britain. It's influenced everything from how the NHS is funded to what kind of reforms are seen as acceptable to the public.
So on one hand, you could argue that this nostalgia surrounding the NHS is a good thing. It reflects a deep appreciation for what the NHS stands for, this belief in accessible healthcare for all. But on the other hand, this nostalgia could also be a barrier to progress because it's easy to get stuck in this idealized version of the past that might not necessarily reflect the current realities of providing healthcare in the 21st century.
Precisely. And that's a thing about nostalgia, isn't it? It can be this powerful motivator or rallying cry to protect and preserve the things that we hold dear. But it can also blind us to the need for change, for progress, for adaptation.
That's such a powerful insight. And it's something that we all have to grapple with, not just when it comes to healthcare, but in all aspects of our lives. It's about recognizing that while the past can be a source of comfort, inspiration, and even wisdom, it shouldn't dictate how we live our lives today, how we shape the future. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. But we'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever stopped to consider how nostalgia might be shaping your own worldview? Let us know. And be sure to join us next time when we'll be taking a deep dive into another fascinating topic.